first of all, congratulations on what a hell of a run so far in your career, but also on this book, because it's a step to the side, I think, in a lot of ways from what maybe people thought your path should be.
Thank you. No, I've had so much fun branching into literary fiction. I I don't like reading novels in the same genre. I like to read all sorts of stuff, and I don't like writing in the same genre either. I have a very small attention span, so I get bored easily. And after four books of big, heavy, epic fantasy doorstoppers, I thought I want to try out a different narrative voice for a while. And I don't know, people seem to like it.
Well, and this one is so of the time. Like, it is very much like you can, because you're using experiences and technologies and things that everybody's been living really intensely over the last couple of years. Like, it feels very much like in this moment, something that must have been more fun to kind of explore, because it could flow out of you in a very different sort of way.
The nice thing about writing a novel set in the contemporary era is that you have to do a lot less research because you are just describing what your life is like in the social media environment that you're in. I've had a lot of people tell me that this feels like a pandemic novel, even though COVID-19 is not directly referenced in the novel. And I think the reason why is because I wrote it in early 2021. And for a lot of us, we were still in lockdown. We weren't seeing anybody. My fiance and I spent that entire year in Florida away from most of our family and friends. And I was just caged indoors constantly. And my only connection to the outside world was through social media. So it is a very internet heavy novel, but it's a novel that also explores what happens when your perception of other people, the way that you form your paranoias and rivalries and jealousies and decide whether you like somebody else or not is based on fragments of their selves, distorted fragments that are only shared on social media. So it's an internet book from an era when all we had was the internet.
That's right. And the other thing I think that sort of that it took me to, and that, I mean, it extends beyond eras and beyond technologies, was I wondered so much, a character like June, in fact, all of them, I just wonder what it would be like if their friend groups were different. And I think, when you realize what happened in the last couple of years, people had to take a lot of stock because they had a lot of time to think and they couldn't be distracted the same way. The whole concept of a toxic friendship, not above and beyond toxic relationships, it's just, man, if you had better people around you, what would your life have been like? And I wondered that a lot when I was reading about almost every one of these characters.
A common trait between both June and Athena is that they're both so utterly alone, and they don't have a lot of friends, and they're good at driving people away. And I think about community and isolation and carving out your own path while making sure you remain rooted to one another a lot as it relates to creative life, because a lot of people think that you have to be solitary in order to be a successful creative. And I partly think this is true. There's a nice anecdote where a young writer asked John Banville if he had any advice for him, and John Banville said, well, the first thing you need to know is that you are completely alone in this. And I do think at the moment when it's just between you and the page and you have to get words down, that is something that nobody else can help you with. You can't be live tweeting your process through writing a novel. It just has to be you and the work. At the same time, I think a healthy existence in today's literary economy is only possible if you have a strong community around you, people who help you keep grounded, people that you can talk to in person and not on Twitter, people who can tell you who you're being ridiculous, people who you can vent your ugly feelings to. And if you have that, then you're solid, right? And I feel very lucky to have that. But June and Athena don't, which is why their ugly feelings get vented all over the internet, and there's nobody help them when they fall.
Right. And we know, without spoiling, because we still want people to go through this so they haven't got to the end, I believe it's near the end of the book where, because Athena doesn't get, nobody likes her for a large part of this, but there's just even this little moment at the end where she gets her redemption when she was contained. She couldn't branch out. And so she was also struggling in this little box that everybody expected her to stay in. And so you do drop these little moments of empathy, I suppose, for everybody, right? And I think that was that part of the beginning of the process, or did that come later when you had to revisit how these characters played out?
Yeah, well, I've spent most of my career writing deeply unlikable characters. The main character of the Popular trilogy famously commits genocide at the end of the first book. And the main character of Babel, I like to think he's a little more likable, but he also does atrocious things by the final act. And something that I'm always really careful about when I'm designing characters is that nobody is ever evil without reason. Or I guess maybe some people are. Maybe some people are just sociopaths who enjoy other people's pain. But I think as far as literary villains go, those characters don't tend to be very interesting. I'm much more interested in characters who do very wrong things, but think they're right the entire time, who do have the capacity for empathy, who do have people close to them that they care a lot about, and who do have hopes and dreams, because then the reader is interested in following them. Even if you disagree with them every step along the way, you're still curious to see where they go next, because as villainous as June is, there's still a reason. There's still something, things have made her the way she is, right? She's suffered a lot at the hands of publishing. She's had horrible experiences as a novelist that I wouldn't wish on anybody. And she's manifested it in very warped ways. She has a completely skewed outlook on how the industry operates in relation to race, but she's still quite sympathetic.
Well, and I think there's elements like, it's obviously often it's the Machiavelli attribution, but I think about William S. Burroughs, who wrote that poem "Wouldn't You," and you get it right to Tolkien in The Ring, and what would you do? This if the situation was presented to you, how would you behave? And I think sometimes, especially because in Yellowface, there's this an amazing display of vitriol, I think, from a lot of people towards each other, that it forces me and you, I suppose, when you write it, what would you do? Do the ends justify the means? Like, to get to where you got to go, would you do these things? Would you think this way? How would it affect your behavior? I felt like that was very prevalent in the book.
Yeah, well, the thing is, June doesn't even think that she's done anything wrong. She has a very strong justification for why she steals Athena's manuscript, and that is just that the work deserves to see the light of day. A finished, polished novel is better than an incomplete manuscript, and she is a talented writer. There's that scene, that hilarious scene where she's editing over Athena's voice and inserting her own opinions and trimming the text to make it seem more commercial and readable. And some of this is, obviously some of it is bullshit, but some of it is valid. June is a good critic and she's making good additions to the text. So she's thinking to herself, well, shouldn't I deserve some of the credit? I mean, I did work very hard on this. I earned this. I'm worthy of this novel. It should be under my name. And she's not even thinking of it as theft anymore, but rather an artistic collaboration.
Oh, I think about that line, Athena is my worst nightmare. She's all the things I hope it'll never be true of myself. And I feel like that's your line, but it's amazing how when you spend time pushing yourself into places you wouldn't have otherwise done, you have to justify it. I think you get face to face with some pretty scary possibilities.
Yeah, and you have to be able to see yourself doing everything your characters do. Otherwise, you can't write them in a way that's compelling. There has to be a part of your own soul in even your nastiest characters. Otherwise, you're not writing a person, you're writing a cardboard cutout.
Writing a cardboard cutout, that's true. But some places are just harder to go. Were there parts of this that you didn't like being in, places with characters writing?
I've written about some really difficult, traumatic, painful things across my entire body of work. And when I was writing the Popular trilogy and Babel, there were areas that I couldn't stay in that headspace for very long. I had to stand up and take a walk. It's just hard to think about that all the time. That never happened with Yellowface. I only ever had fun writing Yellowface, no matter how nasty and sarcastic and disgusting the characters are. I think it's a bit like the glee of watching Succession. I mean, it has you on your knees. It's so cringy. Everybody's a terrible person, but it's so funny. And I think at this point, the horrors and the absurdity of everything that goes on in publishing, the very racist practices that go on in contemporary publishing, were just so ridiculous to me that the only possible reaction was to take a step back and laugh at it. And the other reason why I had fun with Yellowface is because it was fun finally writing in June's voice and thinking from her perspective, because June is the kind of person that I've encountered very often throughout publishing. There's always somebody who's willing to tell you to your face that you don't really belong where you are, that the only reason why anybody reads your work is because it ticks off a diversity checkbox, that you're only the fad of the moment and the fad is diversity. And if nobody were interested in diversity, then nobody would care about your stories at all. And I've been hearing this over and over throughout my career. And at a certain point, you just start internalizing it too. You start wondering, do I deserve any of my opportunities? Is my work of any value, or is it only interesting because I'm Chinese American? And writing Yellowface is my chance to take that cruel voice and just put it on a page and spell out all of its ridiculous, inarticulate logic. And sunlight is the best disinfectant. So you see how absurd it all is. And then I close the covers and I've trapped it and I'm able to put it away on a shelf now.
Did you reach a point where you recognized that you weren't ticking the box, that you were there because on merit?
I mean, I'm always going to question this about myself. It's those doubts that never quite go away. But as long as I'm here, I'm going to keep telling stories. And as long as there are readers that those stories matter to, then I don't care what anybody else says.
Is this a revenge book?
Well, it's not revenge against any particular person or institution. I actually was quite apprehensive when we put this novel out on submission, and my agent initially didn't even want to submit it at all, because she thought that my current publisher, I've actually been at the same publisher for my entire career, she thought that they would feel quite offended by this book. And it's easy to see how many people in publishing would feel offended by this book. But I've actually been so lucky in how my team has reacted to this manuscript. We were so scared of everyone's reactions. We did think, would people wonder, are we just out to get them? Are we out to drag their names through the mud? But Yellowface is a novel that is only about negative interactions in publishing. I've had some pretty bad experiences. I've had many more good experiences. And what Yellowface doesn't capture is the number of people in publishing who are there for genuine love of the story, for love of the authors, who are where they are and being paid far too little for it, because they are also interested in getting voices and stories out to audiences that they haven't heard before. And I think my entire team was ready to do that soul searching with me and do that ruthless self-criticism of publishing and things that we've done in marketing my previous books. I mean, we've just all had so much fun poking fun at myself and my career and the way that they've marketed my work. And it was a really wonderful collaborative process. And I just feel so lucky that my team has been down to get on this ridiculous train.
I imagine for that first second when somebody said they were reluctant to submit this, that must have felt strange.
Yeah, I mean, that's never happened with any of my other work. And we sat down, we talked about it, and I explained why it mattered so much to me that this novel went out into the world, and she stood by me and she really put her neck on the line for me. And that's the reason why I'm also still with the same agent.
Right. That's what you need. You need people who it's not even so much about loyalty. I feel sometimes it's just somebody who understands you. And I think that's crucial.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't have faith in the manuscript, but she had faith in me, and that's all you need.
I can't, you talked about the diversity checkbox, and the diversity, obviously, this comes up a lot in Yellowface. And you talk about how you've been marketed, and this ability for you to poke fun at yourself is really nice. But do you like the way people talk about you and your books? Do you like the way presentations are sent to you about how you're pitched, about how books are sold? Do you like your relationship with the industry that way?
I have a lot more control over how I'm talked about and how I'm marketed now because I've been in this game for a few years. When I sold my first novel, The Poppy War, I had just turned 20. I actually got the call with the initial offer on my 20th birthday. So I wrote that novel when I was a teenager. And when you're that young and it feels like all your dreams have come true, you say yes to anything, right? You feel like you have no right to protest or speak up for yourself. So there was a lot that happened during my first year in publishing that made me deeply uncomfortable. I did feel like I was being put in a little box of, this is just our Chinese American story. This is our Chinese American author. I got to see an in-house marketing document at one point, and it had the top 5 qualities about me that were attractive or would be interesting to booksellers. And the very first quality was she's Chinese American. So she has this ability to write authentic stories at a time when authenticity is important. And I don't even know what that means. And I found this deeply frustrating because I'm very proud of being Chinese American. I don't think that's the most interesting thing about me. I think that there are many other aspects of my craft and my own personality that are worth talking about other than just a very blanket, flat racial marketing label. And I've pushed back against that over the years, and now I really do get a say in how my stories are talked about and how I market them and how I'm presented. And that's a process of growth and learning to trust your team and learning to stand up for yourself. And I wasn't able to do that in the beginning.
You have I think the authenticity thing is really important to unpack a little bit, because there's one point in Yellowface in all caps, almost like a heading. It's not a new chapter, but it's there. Who has the right to write about suffering? And it's that conversation now, but who is an authentic voice? How far, who gets to write what? And I wondered, and you tackled that right here in the book, just even with that one line. Who gets to write what? So authenticity is important, but when it's a buzzword, it's a pitfall, isn't it?
It's very reductive, and it's unclear what authentic even means. And I think the way that we talk about authenticity in publishing and literary identity is very basic and ill-considered, because it seems like what people are saying is that the only way that you can authentically write a story is if you have lived experience with that story. I think that would be a very sad framework to apply to writing, because that would mean that we couldn't write fiction anymore. We could only write autobiographies. We could only write about things that we personally had been through. And I'm not interested in only writing about family trauma and immigrant stories. If I want to write an epic fantasy novel with dragons and have never met a dragon, then I think I should be able to. I think when people have questions about authenticity, the questions that they ought to be asking is, what is the text doing? So people are always very willing to say, if you aren't from this racial identity, then you're not allowed to write about this race. Or if you hadn't had personal experience with this kind of marginalization, you should stay in your lane and not write about that. I don't think those standards are very helpful. I think better questions are, in what ways are you writing about that? How are you engaging with that community? How are you presenting them? Are you kind of uncritically or unthinkingly recycling harmful tropes and stereotypes in previous literature? Or are you doing something to subvert that or respond to that? How good is the work? And this is just an issue at the level of textual criticism. And another question that I think people really want to ask when they have conversations about authenticity is, who is getting those opportunities? We see from industry reports year after year that it's still overwhelmingly white, the number of authors who are being published compared to authors from non-white backgrounds. And that's a question of, why does publishing think that only some people are worthy of large advances or being platformed, and why do they think certain faces are not marketable? And that's different from the question of who has the authentic right to write what kind of story.
Yeah, and I think it's you're right, and it exists in all industries, in any kind of storytelling industry. That is a conversation that I think people are having. They're trying to figure out how to have it. They don't have the tools, I think, to know how to talk about it in a way that speaks on the level that you are. I wondered what your extensive debate club experience, not just as a debater, but as like a coach and a traveling coach, like what that brings to your writing.
I think it's helped with so much. So for context, I competed in Lincoln Douglas debate for 4 years through high school. And then I taught at some debate camps and coached high school debate for a few years in college. So, and actually I'm getting married next June and my high school debate coach is officiating my wedding. So that's how important debate has been to my life.
Awesome.
I'll tell one story. When I was in middle school, well, through a lot of elementary school and middle school, I actually had a speech impediment where I would make all the right shapes with my mouth. And I knew how to correctly pronounce things, but I could never make myself heard because I was so terrified of getting things wrong. And I spoke Chinese as a first language. I learned English upon moving to the US. So for the first few years in the US, I was mispronouncing everything. And that terror of mispronouncing things made me just unwilling to enunciate or put any breath into any word I uttered. So I was just, silently mouthing the words. And it's not until my first debate tournament where I got on stage and I had all the adrenaline, and more importantly, I had that competitive urge. My opponent was this other freshman kid, he was shaking, he was so scared, and I thought, I really want to win. And suddenly I was yelling, I was enunciating, I was speaking like I've never spoken before. So I mean, they say as a cliche, high school debate helps you find your voice, but debate literally helped me find my voice. And I learned what it was like when people are actually listening to me. And that's a feeling of empowerment that will never go away. I think the other thing too is that when you're giving a speech and it's a crowded room, there's a kind of electric connection that you can feel when you're speaking on a level that your audience is resonating with. It could be that you're telling a joke that's particularly funny, or you're making an argument that they think is particularly good. But I've never been able to feel that or to forget that electric connection. And I take that to my writing too, because sometimes I'm writing scenes and I know this is going to be the scene that a reader highlights and bookmarks and comes back to over and over again. You just develop this sense of how to speak or write in a way that people will pay attention to.
Totally. And I think also the other takeaway from that is you identified the vulnerability in your opponent and you pounced on them. Like you saw their fear and you went right at it. You saw an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, well, writing, that's all fun and good when you're in high school and you're competing. But when you're later in life, when you're writing for a popular audience, it can't be about identifying fears and vulnerabilities in other writers. You have to be doing it for yourself and your own message.
Absolutely. Before I let you go, there's a couple of things I want to ask you about. One of them is you said something really interesting, that it's important to read things that push your own boundaries, essentially. What kind of text, where do you go to read things that make you uncomfortable or challenge you? What do you have a wheelhouse for that?
I go backwards in time.
Yeah.
Something I think about a lot is that the voice of contemporary fiction starts sounding the same the more of it you read. And I think especially in certain genres like contemporary epic fantasy, my worry about continuing to write fantasy after I put out 4 fantasy novels is that everybody sounds like everybody else. And there's a good reason for this, which is just that we're picking up on each other's good habits and we're mimicking styles that sell well, but it gets boring after a while. Everybody starts molding into this singular pattern. So the only way to break out of that writing style, to use different imagery, to change up the rhythm and flow of your sentences, to reach for different metaphors. Well, I said I go backwards in time. I also leave English. So the first thing is that I try to read a lot of work that's by dead writers, and just the cadence of somebody publishing in the 1950s is very different. The dialogue feels different, and that difference is refreshing, and it's pushing my boundaries of what I can do with a sentence. Now, once I've mastered what you can do with the sentence, my next goal is to break English and to stretch it. And the way you do that is by reading as much as you can in a different language, because the metaphors are all different, the allusions are different, the sentence structures are different, literally the way you move through the world and process it sensorially is different. And you take all of that and you bring it back to English and try to figure out how you can stretch the words that English has to mimic a feeling in a different language. Right.
Well, and do you think there's anything to when you're going back and reading the dead writers and that for lack of a better phrase, they existed creatively in a vacuum. That the only time they knew what people thought of them is if they met them, or if they would get some kind of feedback. But there wasn't this connectedness that we have. So everybody knows what authors think for the most part. You can get real-time critiques, and you're a human being, so you're not going to be unaffected by what people say about you on either where any human being on social media or elsewhere. So that now it's much harder to have the quiet place in your brain without outside interference, because there's so many things. Do you think that affected some of the writing?
Oh yeah, I mean, we started off talking about this, that sense of focus, I think, is increasingly diminished by being an online person.
Right.
I just don't think that we were meant to know what thousands of people thought of us. That's too much feedback, and our little brains can't possibly process all of that. I mean, there's a lot of kind feedback, there's also a lot of nasty feedback, and I think we just weren't built to weigh it all and consider it all, because it's far too much for any one person to sort through. So I find myself constantly looking for ways to return to that previous era of peace and quiet where I can pretend I'm Charles Dickens. And the only way I can do that is by tuning out social media altogether. So I have very strict boundaries about when I go online and what I post online and what I talk about, and more importantly, what I read about myself, which is nothing. I refuse to read any reviews except for the very nice ones that my team sends me. But
don't even read those.
I mean, I know writers who go looking for bad reviews of themselves and respond to those reviews and want to get into conversations about them. And maybe that works for them, but I can't see how it would help my writing at all. I think the most important thing for me is to retain that focus and that singular relationship between me and the page. And the only way I can do that is to block out everybody and everything else.
You read things that challenge your values?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of work that's published in the 20th century. Yeah. I mean, I'm reading East of Eden by Steinbeck right now, and Steinbeck has been roundly criticized by a lot of Asian American writers. The portrayal of the character, the Chinaman, Mr. Lee in East of Eden, is problematic. I don't know. And there are a lot of people who would say just don't read Steinbeck because he's racist. And I don't really believe in tossing out literature because there are flawed representations within it. I do believe in sitting in history and learning from works that have come before. And I think it's always better to read and know and think about it rather than pretend like it doesn't exist.
What's your thought now on I'm sure the industry is going to love publishing a bunch of AI novels and AI writing. Where are you at with that?
I'm not afraid of the machine, and I don't know many writers who are, because what's very clear about AI is that it doesn't have the capacity to do something new. It's designed to replicate everything that already exists. It's like a big blur tool, which is how the sci-fi writer Ted Chiang describes it. And I think it's a good metaphor. But all of the writers I love are people who are doing something new with English and pushing language in ways that we've never seen before. That's why we all love Shakespeare, because he invented most of the words that we use now. And that's why I love writers like Nabokov so much, because he's coming in from Russian, he treats English like this buffet of options, and he's juxtaposing words that I never would have thought to put together. And an AI is not going to do that, because an AI isn't interested in play. The AI isn't thinking about anything. It's just trying to replicate what's come before. But we want to read what's new. I think the best writers now are doing something that we've never seen before. And that always will be the mark of good writing.
I mean, just by saying Nabokov, there's somebody out there whose skin probably crawled, right? Because there's people who would call out the stuff that Nabokov written. I like what you say about that. I think that is based on a hopeful view of humanity, which is that they want original things, which is but that's great. No, I think you're right. Absolutely. At least I very much so agree with you. Where are we at with Poppy Wars and TV? And where are we with that?
Well, I don't know anything. I get whatever updates they tell me, and they haven't given me any updates, so I don't know. I'm not very involved with the TV or film process for any of my books, as far as I'm concerned. When there's money on the table, which usually means an option deal, that's fine. That's good news. Everything else is so hypothetical, and I have so little control over that I choose not to think very much about it at all. What I have control over is the novel, so I'll focus on that.
I know what the last thing is one of your great skills is you just jump from genre to genre, style to style. So you're not becoming one kind of author anymore. So where do you go next? Because you've already done a trilogy and your prequels, sequels. Like, where are you at with this now?
So I have a book coming out in 2025. It's called Calabasas. It's another fantasy novel, but I'm mucking around in what I'm calling nonsense literature, which is about literature, which is literature about places that don't make any sense, that don't follow rules, that rearrange themselves and fall apart upon closer inspection. So I'm actually rereading closely Alice in Wonderland, and I'm reading novels like Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, novels in which the world is deeply confusing and any attempt to master the world is only going to frustrate and drive you mad. And I'm wondering what works about this style of story. If there's nothing solid to hold on to, then what is the thread keeping the reader invested throughout the entire book? And I think that has to come from character.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time and enjoying our Strombo's book club for your new book. I really appreciate that.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good time.